welcome to the MoneyMagpie Invest podcast. I'm Jasmine Birtles, founder of MoneyMagpie. And before I do anything, I must say that right now you need to follow us, you need to subscribe, you need to comment as well at the end of the piece. Certainly, we're always interested in your comments. We always answer them. So do that. And do know that nothing that's said today should be taken as financial advice. It's financial information. So got that out of the way. And the important thing to know is that today I'm speaking to Steve Baker, former Conservative MP. And this is a kind of follow-up to an interview that we did a few months ago. Steve, thank you so much for joining.
Well, you're very welcome. Delighted to be here.
So, Steve, last time we spoke, which was a few months ago, you were saying that we probably have somewhere between 15, 20 years of money, of state money left to pay for all the things that the state pays for, NHS, state pension, benefits, etc. But quite a lot has happened since then. There's been a lot of spending. So I thought we could do with an update to see where the clock is as far as you're concerned.
Do you know, it's very difficult to say other than that the situation has got worse. So, two things have happened since we last spoke, very significant. First, because Conservatives and Reform both opposed the removal of winter fuel payments from the better off pensioner, that meant that Labour did a U-turn. Well, unfortunately, I'm sorry to folks who feel that it's unjust. I'm sorry. I remember when it came in, people were telling me they were going to spend the money on a good bottle of whiskey or give it to charity. It was, I'm afraid, for better off pensioners, it was a bit of a joke at the time. What ought to have happened is we ought to look after genuinely poor pensioners better, but we shouldn't be giving universal benefits to people who don't need them. So that it was a real mistake to remove that policy to keep on with a universal payment to people who don't need it. But I'm afraid that's politics. Conservatives and Reform knew it was hitting their voters and it was an easy target, so they went for it. And the other thing that's happened, of course, is on disability benefits spending. Whatever one may think of the policy, the government had decided to reduce benefits spending, and Labour MPs wouldn't vote for it. And they put on an absolutely huge rebellion. Over the year since they were first elected, the Labour whips have really put the thumbscrews on Labour MPs and taken the whip off people. That means they can't stand again as a Labour MP. And because they've used such draconian tactics for discipline, Labour MPs did the obvious thing. They brought forward an enormous rebellion, too large to squash through taking the whip away. And so, of course, that meant that Keir Starmer couldn't proceed. These two things taken together show that this Labour government is really now vanishingly unlikely to control public spending. And that's very, very serious and makes things worse into the future.
Yeah, I do feel, and I'm sort of smiling as I say this, but I do honestly feel a bit sorry for Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves because my feeling is that they know what they need to do. They know they need to make cuts, but their own party won't let them, and certainly the voters won't let them. Is that the impression you're getting?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we can only speculate why poor Rachel Reeves was in that state of anguish, and we're told it was personal. But if it was only about the public finances, you'd understand it. Look, I don't mind telling your viewers, your listeners, that I once raised this with Rishi Sunak when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer in front of about 30 other MPs, put to him the OBR's figures about debt soaring away with age-related spending and revenues stagnating, and that leading to us effectively defaulting on age-related spending over the years ahead. And he said, "Yes, you're right, Steve." And you could have, heard a pin drop. MPs heard me, and eventually somebody said, "But this election's not the time to do anything about it." And this is the problem with politics: is politicians generally don't want to be honest with the public and say, "Well, here are the OBR figures. They show revenues soaring on age-related spending and taxation stagnating. This means bankruptcy within our lifetimes. It means we're going to chronically default on spending. We need to do something about it. And that something is go for growth. The only way to grow for growth is tax cuts and indeed regulatory changes. But if we're going to have tax cuts, we've got to cut spending. And I'm afraid it's going to mean spending cuts that people won't like. And it's going to mean spending cuts soon. And because politicians don't like to say that, we've ended up in this chronic position. Now, I bet some of your listeners are screaming at the computer as they watch this. Why didn't you do something about it as an MP, Steve? Well, I made my maiden speech in this area. I talked about a fiscal catastrophe looming in about 2011. I talked endlessly about it. I wrote endlessly about it. Yesterday, I was clearing out my papers. I found a speech I made in 2021 about it. I'm afraid the truth is, very few people pay any attention to speeches by backbench MPs in the House of Commons. I've said it time and time again. It's now crystallising.
There are a few things that I want to say out of that. Firstly, though, what are the actual figures? Because in the last few months, the amount that we've spent already has gone up. So surely the debt must have increased massively.
Yeah, so the figures are all huge. They're all astronomical. I would encourage people, if they want the latest figures, to have a look at the Institute for Fiscal Studies website. They're pretty impartial, pretty good at this stuff, and also the Office for Budget Responsibility, plus the Office for National Statistics. I did some research earlier. In June 2025, the public sector borrowed £20.7 billion, 6.6 billion more than in June 2024. So up by 6.6 billion in a year, and 3.5 billion above the OBR's March forecast. So that's an indication of just how much worse it had got. The current budget deficit, that's how much the government is spending more than it's taking in tax, was £16.3 billion. That ranked as the third highest June deficit since records began in 1997. So it's really very, very serious. Year to date borrowing, £44.5 billion, up 6.5 billion from the same period in 2024. So I'm afraid it's all getting a lot worse, and I won't pretend it's not a worrying time.
Yeah, particularly as the cost of borrowing is going up and is likely to continue to go up if our government is seen to be mismanaging the economy, I assume.
Well, yeah, so the way that the credit markets work is really quite sophisticated. One of the things we have to say is let's not pretend that this money is being borrowed from savers. Some of it is. But if you look back to the COVID period, the Office for Budget Responsibility showed us what was going on. There was the chart going up of government borrowing, and next to it, alongside those bars on the chart, was the figures for what's called quantitative easing, in colloquial terms, money printing. And it was about the same amount of money was created by the Bank of England as was borrowed by the government. And this, I'm afraid, is what happens. Money is created when banks lend, and very often this money comes into existence in response to government borrowing, not just people's mortgages and so forth, but that also creates money, and that in the end is inflationary. So that's why we had that big surge of inflation washing through. And it does mean that as we go into the future, government borrowing is likely to be inflationary. So people should be looking after themselves and looking after the value of their savings. And they should take professional advice on how to do that.
Now, another thing that comes from what you were just saying, I found when I do talks, and particularly if I do stuff on social media, the number one thing that people say in response to me saying we've got to have cuts, we've got to sort out the immigrants. There is a general idea that if we get rid of the immigrants, particularly the ones, the ones who've come in on the small boats, then it'll all be sorted. I'm trying to say that I mean it's a start, but it's not even close, I would say, to covering what we really need to cover. What are your feelings about that?
What you've said is right, I'm afraid. And unfortunately, irresponsible politicians have created the impression that the public have relayed to you. And friends of mine would like me to stop being mean about Nigel Farage, but I listened to one clip by Nigel Farage talking very sensibly about the scale of the fiscal crisis we face, and then he blamed migrants. And I'm afraid the figures just don't add up doing that. The problem we've got is unfunded state pensions, unfunded public sector pensions. It is just soaring liabilities for social care, for health care. I mean, adult and child social care at councils is ruining them. These are the really serious areas of spending. Of course, we're spending far too much on migrant hotels, and of course, it should be cut. And that certainly should happen, but it won't solve the problem that we face with age-related spending. And I'm afraid any politician who suggests that dealing with the migrant issue can balance the books really either doesn't know their stuff or they're being deliberately misleading. Now, I suspect in Nigel's case, he doesn't really know his stuff, but that itself is worrying because he could be our next Prime Minister.
Yes, absolutely. And then the other thing that I was thinking as you were speaking just earlier is about France, for example, which has the same problem. I mean, Europeans, and not just Europeans, the West, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, America, they all have basically the same sort of problem as us, an aging population, too many giveaways and not enough workers to pay for it. So they're in France just trying to make a couple of pretty sensible cuts in their last budget last year, actually destroyed the government. Do you see that happening here?
Well, yeah, that's right. Michel Barnier's government fell in France over adjustments to pensions. I don't think this Labour government will fall over it, but I think they'll get themselves into terrible trouble over it. But the real problem we face here is that politicians tell untruths to the public, and the public unfortunately believe them. Everybody wants to believe that they can live at someone else's expense, and people will say, I paid into the system throughout my working life. And it's true. People paid their national insurance contributions in good faith. That is absolutely true. Just unfortunately, other politicians earlier spent that money on people's pensions at the time. And that's the problem we face. There isn't a big pot of money. There is a thing called the National Insurance Fund, but it's a very small proportion of the total benefits which are paid. It's like having a current account through which all your spending washes. It's not actually a sovereign wealth fund. And this is the problem we face. No amount of pleading that I paid into the system will cause the money to be available. It's not available. And all the predictions are of an enormous gap between spending and tax. Now, we've got a choice as we face up to this. Either we can have a constant scrum as people try to avoid themselves being the ones who face a spending cut, or we can be much more realistic about the sheer scale of the difficulty we're in, go for growth. Growth means tax cuts, that means spending cuts, and have a kind of well-being based approach which says we're going to prioritize the least well off. And, that would require some ruthlessness because, for example, on special educational needs, a very expensive part of council spending, more and more children have qualified for special educational needs provision. And it's very, very serious. For 14 years as an MP, I saw how upsetting it is for parents and how desperate they are for support. But if we're going to actually have tax cuts and go for growth and solve this problem, even on things like special educational needs and social care, people are going to have to pay for more themselves, and scarce public resources are going to have to be focused on those most in need. And doing that will be very difficult, require an immense amount of courage, and will require politicians to explain to the public honestly what has happened over the years and what lies ahead if we don't deal with it. And, this is the reality we face. The alternative is that we will just run into ruin. And that isn't in anybody's interests because then the correction will be uncontrolled and chaotic.
This is the thing because I mean you've talked about MPs lying, and those are the ones of course that want to keep their jobs, and I've mentioned Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer who know what they should do but can't. And I'm just thinking about human nature. Certainly, the nature of MPs is to do what's expedient for them at the time. And it just seems to me, when I keep thinking about what's the solution here, the only solution I can see, and maybe you can see a better one, is that we wait until the crash, and then whoever's in power goes, look, there is no money. We are going to have to make cuts, and people go, oh, all right, yeah. Because at the moment they don't believe it, as you say, that they just want to make sure that they have their stuff for right now.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I'm afraid it's a bit of an in-joke for politicians, but the public in aggregate would like higher spending and lower taxes. In other words, they'd like someone else to pay. And that is why all this goes terribly wrong. It's why for 50 years we've had chronic inflation. I mean, the value of the pound has collapsed since 1971, and the last link to gold was severed in the Bretton Woods system. And money's value has collapsed. Priced in gold, houses today are worth about the same as they were in the 50s. I was amazed to discover that when I found the figures from pricedingold.com online. But if you price houses in pounds, of course, they've just zapped away from the public. It's practically impossible for young people to buy now. And this is the problem, is that to support chronic borrowing, to have the credit conditions which are easy enough for the government to keep borrowing, you have to have chronic money creation as debt. And that's where the value of the pound has gone. So I think what is actually going to happen is we're going to have a terrible fiscal and inflationary crisis, out of which we'll need a Milei-style government. But look what it took to get Argentina to the position that they elected President Milei, and his policies are working. I mean, this is the bitter irony: is we can now see now. I always knew that freedom works, and I know the theoretical reasons, but now we've got a very practical example in front of us in Argentina. Well, we can either ignore that example, go wandering into crisis ourselves, blundering into crisis ourselves, and then hope that someone turns up to solve the problem. Or we can have an educated public who insist on better politics from their elected representatives who face up to things now. Now, that seems a stretch. It seems naive and idealistic to believe it might happen. But I tell you what, I'm going to make sure that I do everything in my power to give the public the opportunity to insist on better politics and to avoid the crisis which otherwise is in our future.
Yeah, it seems inevitable to me. So, I mean, I'm going to move on in a minute to what we could potentially do right now, but I'm just thinking you've mentioned gold, and it does sound to me like if we're going to avoid as individuals, if we're going to avoid the problems of inflation, which we're already seeing, gold seems to be the best place to put your money to keep its value. Do you think of that's the right place, or can you think of other places to put your money?
Well, certainly people, as you said earlier, will need professional financial advice to work things out for themselves. But I observed that the price of gold, though it's been stagnant in the last month or so, has absolutely soared over the last 5 years. And this has been typical of gold. When fiat money is in trouble, the value of gold soars against fiat money, but is actually relatively stable against real assets like, for example, houses. So yeah, I'm a fan of gold. I'm also buying Bitcoin. But my own portfolio, in course, includes equities and bonds as well. And I think people do have to have a sense of balance. But they're going to have really expert advice. But I think there's a place for all of us to own some physical gold and some Bitcoin.
Yeah. And then I'm just thinking again about how we as consumers, investors, voters can bring this conversation to the table because it does seem, as you've mentioned about Rishi Sunak, MPs don't want to talk about it. It's a vote loser because the only solutions, it seems to me, are complete vote losers. So what do we as consumers, voters, investors do to bring this conversation to the table and get those who need to face it to face it?
The single most powerful thing your viewers, your listeners can do is to join the political party of their choice. And I can almost feel them groaning. It costs about £25 a year to be a member of the Conservative Party. And it means that you're one of only several hundred people in a constituency of, say, 75,000 who can turn up and say to candidates when they go for selection, whether it's to council or to Parliament, you can say to them, what are you going to do about these projections from the Office for Budget Responsibility? You don't have to quote Steve Baker. You can go and pick up projections from the OBR. I mean, they are available from all my social media feeds and websites. I've written the paper. I'll give you the link to the paper people can pick up. But just say to your candidates, what are you going to do about this? If you did something about this, I would support you. I know it will involve hard choices, but I support you taking those measures necessary to avoid a horrific fiscal and economic crisis by going for growth through tax cuts, which means spending cuts. What are you going to do? Because the reality, having been a candidate, the reality is your party members are immensely powerful. If you go to a selection meeting, there might only be 17, 20 people there. I mean, at my reselection for the last election, I'd been given the nod that somebody was going to try and move against me, not for any particular reason, mostly because he wanted to be the MP a long time ago, and he's never forgiven me for beating him. And so I turned up and I thought, you know what, if the association doesn't support me, I won't fight it. I'll just go quietly. And then I sat in the room and there were only about 11 people there. And I realized that four of them were his friends. I thought, right, I'm definitely fighting this one if I lose. I'm not allowing half a dozen people to remove me as the candidate. Now, this might sound absurd to people, but this is what you actually face as a candidate. But if you had 100 people in the room, just 100 people out of 75,000 electors, and 100 turned up and said, we want you to do something about the looming fiscal crisis, my goodness, we'd have an army of candidates for Parliament who might do something. And it only takes 100 people per constituency at the moment to really transform a Conservative association. Now, if you can get Labour voters and Lib Dem voters and Green voters to go and say the same to their candidates, great. I doubt it will happen, but if you can get it done, great. But yeah, influence people legitimately by joining the party of your choice and demanding that your candidates do sensible things.
Because I'm just thinking as you're talking about the NHS, because this is a shibboleth, you cannot touch the NHS, but it is the biggest of all the big outlays. So really, I'm guessing people should be saying, how are you going to cut costs? How are you going to reduce the amount that you put into the NHS? But most people are saying, how can we put more into the NHS? What's your view on that?
Well, we're all desperate for high quality healthcare, and we're all desperate to make sure that people who couldn't afford to pay for it themselves receive that essential healthcare at everyone's expense. I mean, that is, I think, a given now. There's no question of having an entirely private healthcare system. That said, of course, prior to the foundation of the NHS, working people received their healthcare through friendly societies which held the whip hand over doctors, and doctors didn't like it very much. And through the BMA, they saw to it that the NHS was established largely to make sure that their pay, their terms and conditions, and the complaints process was taken away from working people and handed over to the governing class. I'm relying on a book called Working Class Patients and the Medical Establishment, which I commend to everybody. So the NHS definitely established partly to further the doctors' interests, and it's not doing us much good at the moment. So with the NHS, we definitely need very serious reform. But even now, sitting here as somebody who's not going to go for election, I need to be really clear. There's no question that in the future, as in the past, measures will have to be taken to make sure that those who couldn't afford healthcare receive healthcare. And anyone who says otherwise is kidding you. But there were great proposals by the IEA for how we could adopt really practical measures from elsewhere in the continent of Europe to provide healthcare with greater efficiency. But of course, people run screaming and say it's privatization. But we're only talking about what works, for example, in the Netherlands. The Netherlands is a civilized place where people get, I think, better quality healthcare. One recent survey showed that the NHS does very well on everything except outcomes. And, I'm afraid outcomes matter. So we should have a serious conversation about the NHS. It will need to become more efficient. That doesn't mean longer hours for lower pay. It means serious reform to make sure that everybody's incentivized to cut out every possible waste.
Yeah. Well, that's fantastic, Steve. Thank you so much for going through all of those. I mean, it does say to me, we have a growing problem, and we, the people, are going to have to take some sort of steps to face it if the MPs won't. And we'll have to make the MPs actually look at it now before it's too late. So thank you
Well,
very Sorry, carry on.
Jasmine, in the end, in a democracy, the public get the government they deserve. This is a democracy. If people would just get involved with political parties and tell their MPs what they require of them, my goodness, we would get change.
That's really good to know. I think we should all join all of the parties and tell each one what they should do. That's great. Thank you so much, Steve. That's been Steve Baker, former Conservative MP, and we've been talking about the looming economic crisis, financial crisis in this country, where we may find ourselves not able to pay for essential services. So it's a lot that we need to think about. I've been Jasmine Birtles. This has been the Money Magpie Invest podcast. And remember, as before, subscribe, follow, tell all your friends, and do comment, because we do always look at the comments and we answer them. Do come back next week.